The desert was trying to kill them before the bomb even had a chance. Robert Oppenheimer stood in the doorway of the McDonald Ranch house, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. The ash was long, threatening to fall onto his trousers, but he didn't notice. He was staring out into the pitch-black void of the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. It was raining, not a gentle summer shower, but a violent biblical deluge. Lightning tore the sky apart, jagged white scars illuminating the scrub brush and the puddles forming in the dirt. Thunder shook the wooden floorboards beneath his feet, rattling the windows in their frames. "It's a sign, Oppie," a voice said behind him. Oppenheimer didn't turn. He knew it was Isidore Robbie. "Don't be superstitious, Isidore. It's just weather." It's a violent electrical storm directly over a 100-foot steel tower holding a plutonium core surrounded by 5,000 pounds of high explosives, Robbie replied dryly. If lightning hits that tower, he didn't need to finish the sentence. If lightning hit the tower at point 0, 10 miles away, the gadget, the beast as some of the scientists called it, would detonate prematurely. There would be no data, no test, just a flash of light and the vaporized bodies of the scientists sleeping at the base camp. Oppenheimer took a drag of his Chesterfield. The smoke seared his lungs, a familiar comfort. He was 41 years old, but in the flashes of lightning, he looked 60. He weighed 115 pounds. His clothes hung off his skeletal frame like they were draped over a wire hanger. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for 3 years. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that bent him double. "Where's Groves?" Oppenheimer wheezed, wiping his mouth with a handkerchief. "He's driving from Albuquerque. He'll be here soon, and he's going to be furious about the rain." 11 p.m. Base camp. General Leslie Groves arrived like a tank rolling into a library. He was a big man, heavy-set, with a mustache that looked like it had been glued on with military precision. He was the engine of the Manhattan Project, the man who had built the Pentagon, the man who bullied logic into submission. He stomped into the command bunker, shaking the rain off his trench coat. "What is the status, Oppie?" Groves barked. "Why is the countdown on hold?" Oppenheimer was sitting on a folding chair, staring at a weather map. "Look outside, General. We can't drop. We can't fire. The B-29 observers can't see the target. The fallout will be pushed by the wind into populated areas. And the lightning is a risk to the arming circuits." Groves slammed his fist onto the table. "We have a schedule. President Truman is in Potsdam meeting with Stalin tomorrow. He needs this card in his pocket. I told him we would have a result." "You cannot order the storm to stop, General," Oppenheimer said softly. His voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to Groves' bellow. Nature doesn't have a chain of command. The tension in the bunker was suffocating. It smelled of wet wool, coffee, and fear. In the corner, Enrico Fermi, the Italian genius, was making a calculation on a notepad. "What are you doing, Enrico?" Groves asked, suspicious of any scientist who was quiet. Fermi looked up, his eyes bright. "I am calculating the probability of the ignition of the atmosphere." Groves went pale. "The what?" "The bet," Fermi said, shrugging. "The boys are taking bets. If the temperature of the detonation exceeds the theoretical limit, the nitrogen in the atmosphere could fuse. It would set the sky on fire. A chain reaction that would encircle the globe." "Stop it," Oppenheimer snapped. Edward Teller ran the numbers. "The probability is near zero. 3 in a million. Near zero is not zero," Fermi smiled. "I'm taking bets on whether we destroy New Mexico or the whole world." Groves looked at them with pure loathing. These men were geniuses, but they were children playing with matches in a dynamite factory. "The test goes ahead," Groves ordered. "We wait for a break in the weather, but we fire at 5:30 a.m. no matter what." July 16th, 1945, 2 a.m. Point 0, 10 miles away, at the center of the blast zone, the bomb sat alone. It was suspended in a corrugated steel shed atop a 100-foot steel tower. It didn't look like a weapon of mass destruction. It looked like a diving bell or a giant, clumsy metal egg. Wires spilled out of it like spaghetti. It was covered in masking tape and patchwork welds. Underneath the tower, a lone figure lay on a cot, reading a paperback novel by the light of a flashlight. It was Donald Hornig, the young scientist in charge of the firing unit. Oppenheimer had asked him to babysit the bomb. The storm was raging directly overhead. Thunder cracked so loud it shook the tower legs. Hornig looked up at the bomb suspended above his head, 4 tons of terror. He wondered if the lightning rod was grounded properly. If it wasn't, he would be the first human being to be unmade by atomic fire. He wouldn't even have time to register the light. The phone at the base of the tower rang. Hornig picked it up. Hornig, Oppenheimer's voice crackled over the line. Is it dry up there? No, sir. It's pouring. The shed is leaking. I'm using a bucket to keep the water off the X unit. There was a long silence on the other end. Stay with it, Donald, Oppenheimer said. Don't leave it alone. I'm not going anywhere, sir, Hornig said. I don't have a car. 3:30 a.m. South 10,000 bunker. Oppenheimer left the command tent and walked out into the dark. He needed to get away from Groves. He needed to get away from the equations. He walked to the edge of the perimeter wire. The rain was beginning to slacken. The wind was shifting. He thought about the last 3 years. The isolation at Los Alamos. The wire fences. The way he had seduced the best minds in the world to come to a mesa in the desert and build a device of death. He thought about Jean Tatlock, his mistress, who had committed suicide. He thought about his wife, Kitty, at home with a gin bottle. He had given everything to this. His health, his morals, his life. Why? Because of Hitler. That was the reason they started. They had to beat the Nazis to the bomb. But Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered 2 months ago. The race was over. But the machine couldn't be turned off. The momentum was too great. Now, the target was Japan. Or maybe the target was simply history. Oppenheimer looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. He shoved them into his pockets. A jeep pulled up. It was George Kistiakowsky, the explosives expert. He climbed out, looking exhausted. It's clearing, Oppie, Kistiakowsky said. The meteorologist says the storm is breaking. We have a window at 5:30. Oppenheimer looked at the sky. Through the clouds, he saw a single star. It's happening. Oppenheimer whispered. George, do you think we're doing the right thing? Kistiakowsky spat on the ground. We're soldiers now, Robert. Soldiers don't ask if the bullet is right. They just pull the trigger. 5:10 a.m. The final countdown. The order was given. The arming sequence began. Oppenheimer was in the control bunker at South 10,000 yards from the tower. The bunker was made of concrete and earth, reinforced with heavy timbers. It felt like a tomb. Groves had left to go to base camp, 5 miles further back. Oppenheimer was the senior man in the hole. T-minus 20 minutes, the loudspeaker announced. The voice echoed across the desert. Oppenheimer walked over to a wooden post in the bunker. He leaned against it to keep himself upright. His breathing was shallow. Lord, these affairs are hard on the heart, he murmured. General Thomas Farrell, Groves' deputy, watched Oppenheimer. He later wrote that Oppie seemed to be shrinking, getting smaller and smaller as the countdown went on, as if the gravity of the bomb was crushing him. Circuit check complete. A technician called out. Detonators are live. T-minus 10 minutes. A green flare shot up from the tower site 10 miles away. It was the signal. The site was evacuated. The bomb was alone. Oppenheimer closed his eyes. He started reciting poetry in his head. Not the Bhagavad Gita yet. That would come later. Now, he was thinking of John Donne. Batter my heart, 3-person God, T-minus 2 minutes. The bunker fell silent. All the jokes stopped. The Fermi bets stopped. Men put on their dark welding glasses. They lay on the floor, feet pointing away from the blast, face down in the dirt. Oppenheimer didn't lie down. He stood near the periscope, looking at the tiny slit of glass that showed the darkness of the desert. He was trembling so violently that he had to grip the beam with both hands to keep from falling. T-minus 45 seconds. The automatic timer took over. A mechanical clicking sound filled the bunker. Click, 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 like the heartbeat of a dying man. What if it's a dud? Someone whispered. If it was a dud, the war would go on. The invasion of Japan would happen. Millions would die on the beaches. If it worked, T-minus 10 seconds. Oppenheimer stopped breathing. 9, 8, 7. The world held its breath. The desert coyotes went silent. The wind stopped. 3, 2, 1. And then the sun rose in the south. The first thing was not the sound. The first thing was the silence of the light. It didn't just illuminate the desert, it erased it. J. Robert Oppenheimer, clutching the wooden beam in the control bunker, squeezed his eyes shut, but the light went right through his eyelids. It was a searing, brilliant white, whiter than the sun, whiter than a welding arc held against the cornea. It penetrated the cracks in the bunker door. It flooded the periscope. For a fraction of a second, the men lying on the floor saw the X-rays of their own bones through the flesh of their hands covering their eyes. The darkness of the pre-dawn desert was annihilated. The mountains in the distance, which had been invisible 10 seconds ago, were suddenly bathed in a clarity so sharp it looked like a hallucination. Every cactus, every grain of sand, every pebble was lit with the intensity of a noon sun on Mercury. And it was silent. That was the horror of it. The visual violence was absolute, but the world was mute. Oppenheimer opened his eyes. He peered through the thick glass of the bunker's viewing slit. He saw the fireball. It wasn't a simple explosion. It was a living thing. A hemisphere of boiling purple, orange, and green plasma, expanding outward at the speed of thought. It was churning, consuming the oxygen, turning the sand into glass, liquefying the steel tower until it was nothing but vapor. It rose. It kept rising. It was beautiful, in the way a tumor is beautiful under a microscope, complex, vibrant, and deadly. "My God," someone whispered. Then came the heat. Even at 10,000 yards, nearly 6 miles away, it felt like someone had opened the door of a blast furnace. The air inside the cold, damp bunker suddenly spiked in temperature. It was the heat of a star brought down to Earth. And still, no sound. The speed of light had outrun the speed of sound. They were watching a silent movie of the apocalypse. Oppenheimer didn't move. He didn't breathe. His mind, usually a chaotic storm of equations and poetry, went completely still. He was witnessing the death of the old world. The physics he had loved, the elegant math of the quantum realm, had been turned into a hammer to smash reality. Then, 30 seconds later, the roar arrived. Crack! It wasn't a rumble. It was a sharp, physical fracture of the atmosphere. The shockwave hit the bunker with the force of a freight train. The ground heaved. Dust fell from the ceiling, coating the men in a fine gray powder. The wooden beam Oppenheimer was holding vibrated so hard it numbed his hands. Following the crack came the thunder, a rolling, endless, guttural growl that bounced off the mountains, echoing back and forth, sounding like the earth itself was groaning in pain. As the echoes faded, silence returned. But it was different now. It was the silence of a graveyard. Oppenheimer stepped away from the post. His face was a mask. He looked at the others. Kistiakowsky, the explosives expert who had bet a month's salary that the bomb would work, scrambled up from the floor. He was covered in dust, his eyes wide and manic. He ran over to Oppenheimer and threw his arms around him. "Oppie, you owe me $10. Kistiakowsky shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. Oppenheimer blinked. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and took out a $10 bill. His hands were empty of sensation. He handed the money to Kistiakowsky. "It worked," Oppenheimer said. His voice was flat. "It worked." 5:40 a.m. Outside the bunker. They walked out into the dawn. The sun was actually rising now in the east, a pale, weak imitation of what they had just created. To the south, the mushroom cloud was punching a hole in the stratosphere. It stood 40,000 feet high, a pillar of radioactive ash and smoke, capped with a white anvil of ice crystals. It hung over the desert like a tombstone. General Farrell walked up to Oppenheimer. He was weeping. Great, heaving sobs of relief. The pressure, the billions of dollars, the fear of failure. It was all gone. "The war is over," Farrell said, gripping Oppenheimer's hand. Oppenheimer looked at the cloud. It was drifting north, carrying its poison toward the cattle ranches and the sleeping towns. "Yes," Oppenheimer said softly. "As soon as we drop it." It was then that the line came to him. He didn't say it aloud. It wasn't a speech. It was an intrusion, a ghost from a Sanskrit text he had studied years ago. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, and then the darker verse, the one that made his blood run cold. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He looked at the jubilant scientists around him. They were shaking hands, lighting cigarettes, passing a bottle of whiskey. They were celebrating a scientific triumph. But Oppenheimer felt a profound, heavy sickness settling in his stomach. He realized, with a clarity that hurt, that they hadn't just built a bigger bomb. They had broken the seal on the gates of hell. They had given humanity the power to commit suicide. Ken Bainbridge, the director of the test, walked up to him. Bainbridge wasn't celebrating. He looked grim. He looked at Oppenheimer, eye to eye, and delivered the only epitaph that mattered. "Now we are all sons of bitches," Bainbridge said. Oppenheimer nodded. "Yes, we are." Base camp, 7 a.m. The drive back to the main camp was strange. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. General Groves was already on the secure phone to Washington. He was dictating a message to be sent to President Truman in Potsdam. He was triumphant. He was already planning the press release. He was going to tell the world that an ammunition dump had exploded to cover up the truth until the real attack. Oppenheimer walked into the mess hall. He drank a cup of black coffee. His hand shook so badly he spilled it on the table. He felt a disconnect from the people around him. He felt like he was walking underwater. A young physicist ran up to him. "Dr. Oppenheimer, did you see the readings? The yield. It was 18 kilotons. Maybe 20. It's magnificent. Magnificent." Oppenheimer repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He walked out of the mess hall. He needed a walk. He strutted, that famous, loose-limbed walk of his, toward the perimeter fence. He put on his pork pie hat. He looked like the sheriff of a ghost town. He thought about the target committee meetings. He had sat in a room and discussed which Japanese cities should be incinerated. Kyoto? No. The Secretary of War loved the temples there. Hiroshima? Yes. Compact, urban, untouched by firebombing, so the damage could be measured accurately. Measured accurately. He imagined the flash he had just seen, but not over an empty desert. He imagined it over a city. He saw the streetcars melting. He saw the shadows of people burned into the pavement. He saw the skin peeling off children like paper. He stopped walking. He leaned against a fence post and vomited into the sand. August 6th, 1945. Los Alamos. 3 weeks later. The news came over the PA system in the cafeteria. The voice of the announcer was tinny and distorted. "The President of the United States has announced 16 hours ago an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East." The cafeteria erupted. Pandemonium. Men stood on tables and cheered. They whistled. They hugged. They ordered rounds of beer. The secret was out. Their work was validated. They were the heroes who had ended the war. Oppenheimer wasn't in the cafeteria. He was in his office. He heard the cheering through the walls. It sounded distant, grotesque. He knew what had happened. The physics had worked. The implosion lens, the tamper, the polonium initiator. It had all worked perfectly over a city of 300,000 people. He forced himself to walk to the auditorium that evening. He had to address the staff. He was their leader. He was the father of the bomb. The auditorium was packed. As he walked onto the stage, the applause was deafening. They stomped their feet. "Oppie! Oppie! Oppie!" Oppenheimer stood at the podium. He clasped his hands together like a prize fighter, shaking hands with himself above his head. He looked at the sea of faces. Bright, young, intelligent faces. The best minds of a generation. "The world will never be the same again," Oppenheimer said. The crowd cheered. "I'm proud of what we have accomplished," he lied. "My only regret." He paused. The room went quiet, waiting for the punchline, is that we didn't develop it in time to use it against the Germans. The room exploded in laughter and applause. It was a savage, tribal sound. But as he looked out at them, Oppenheimer had a vision. It was a hallucination, born of guilt and exhaustion. He saw the faces in the front row, his friends, his colleagues. But he didn't see them smiling. He saw their skin melting. He saw their flesh falling off their skulls. He saw the auditorium bathe in that terrible, silent white light. He stumbled back from the podium. He felt faint. He cut the speech short. He walked off the stage, past the cheering adulation, and out into the cool night air. He found a spot in the darkness under the pine trees. He lit a cigarette. A young scientist followed him out. Dr. Oppenheimer? That was great. We showed them, didn't we? Oppenheimer looked at the boy. He looked at the stars. Those poor little people, Oppenheimer whispered. Sir, the people in Hiroshima, Oppenheimer said, his voice trembling. Those poor little people. August 9th, 1945. The second drop. 3 days later. Nagasaki. Fat man plutonium. The same device they had tested at Trinity. Groves didn't even call Oppenheimer to tell him it was happening. The military machine was running on autopilot now. They had the bombs, so they used them. Oppenheimer felt a cold dread. One bomb could be justified as a shock to end the war. But two was a massacre. Two was a statement that this was now the standard way of waging war. He sat in his office, writing a letter to the Secretary of War. The safety of this nation cannot lie wholly or even primarily in its scientific or technical prowess. It can be based only on making future wars impossible. He was trying to put the genie back in the bottle, but the bottle was broken. October 25th, 1945. The Oval Office. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Oppenheimer was a national hero. His face was on the cover of Time magazine. He was the new Prometheus. But he was falling apart. He had resigned from Los Alamos. He was drinking heavily. He couldn't sleep without pills. He was summoned to the White House to meet President Harry S. Truman. Truman was jovial. He was bouncing with energy. He wore a double-breasted suit and a wide grin. He saw the bomb as a simple tool, a big hammer that had fixed a big problem. Dr. Oppenheimer. Truman beamed, shaking his hand. It's an honor. You've done a great service for your country. Oppenheimer sat down. He looked haggard. He twisted his hands in his lap. Mr. President, Oppenheimer said, his voice barely audible. I feel we have blood on our hands. The room went dead silent. The smile vanished from Truman's face. He looked at Oppenheimer with a mixture of confusion and disgust. Truman was the one who had given the order. Truman was the one who took the responsibility. And here was this scientist, this crybaby, trying to claim the moral guilt. Truman reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He thrust it at Oppenheimer. Well, here, Truman snapped. Would you like to wipe them? Oppenheimer froze. I told you, Truman said, his voice hard. I made the decision. You just built the thing. The blood is on my hands. Let me worry about that. Oppenheimer realized he had made a mistake. He had come looking for a confessor, but he had found a politician. The Russians will never get the bomb, Truman declared confidently. We have the secret. We will keep it. Mr. President, Oppenheimer said, finding his voice. There is no secret. The physics is known. They will have it in 5 years. Maybe 3. Truman waved his hand dismissively. Never. They don't have the industrial capacity. Oppenheimer stood up. He felt small. He felt like he was talking to a wall. I have to go, Oppenheimer said. As he walked out of the Oval Office, he heard Truman turn to Dean Acheson. Don't ever let that son of a bitch in here again, Truman said. Oppenheimer walked out of the White House gates. He was alone, the hero of the atomic age, the man who had ended the war. He looked up at the sky. It was a clear, blue Washington day. But Oppenheimer didn't see the blue. He saw the fire. He saw the fire waiting behind the blue, waiting for the next button to be pushed, waiting for the next flash that would silence the world forever. He lit a cigarette. His hands were still shaking. He had become death. And now, he had to live with it.